Bibles there, I know that Job 31 is the text where we left off, but we need to pick up in 31-35 in order to continue where we left off this morning. In Job chapter 31, beginning of verse 35, Job had ended his last remark. His final speech says, "Oh, that one would hear me. Behold, my desire is that the Almighty would answer me, and that mine adversary had written a book. If only I could go somewhere and see exactly what it is that God's charging me with." And he says, "Surely I would take it upon my shoulder and bind it as a crown to me. I would declare unto him, unto God, the number of my steps. As a prince would I go near unto him." And it says at the end of 31:40, it says, "Thus the words of Job are ended." As a quick summary of where we left off this morning, we learned a couple of points. The first one being that there are multiple Jobs in the text. Now, of course, like I said this morning, we're talking about one individual. We're talking about one individual who in the crisis reacts to God in a couple of different ways. Sometimes he's depressed and he blames God. And sometimes he's quite pleased with God and he praises His name. There are multiple personalities that are embedded within this character. The second thing we looked at was Job desperately wants to know the answer to the question, why? He's been asking the question, why am I suffering? Why am I going through what I'm going through? And consistently, Eliphaz, Zophar, Bildad have all said, because of your sin. Don't you know this? Don't you know that only wicked men suffer? Haven't you learned this? Haven't you listened to the ancients? And so Job's not going to jive well with that. But nonetheless, the answer to that question has been given by his friends that sin is the reason. And so point number 4, we learned that Job wants a debate with God, as we've just read in 31, 35 through 37. He wants to reason it out with God. And so he said in 23:4, "Oh, if only I could appear before His throne, I'd fill my mouth with arguments and I'd present my cause before Him." And so he's waiting for God to finally engage in a discourse with him. We learned how the tiresome suffering was for a purpose. It shows the senselessness of it all, and that's how Job's looking at it, but at the same time, there's a reason behind it. And we learned that that is God's way of showing that He really trusts God, or God really trusts Job, and that He's placed His trust in Him to come through the crisis with shining colors. It's from this now that we resume when we take a look at chapter 32. We run into this man, so says 32 in verse 1, that there are the three men, Eliphaz, Zophar, and Bildad, had ceased to answer Job. And so it says in 32 in verse 2, "Then was kindled the wrath of Elihu, the son of Barachel, the Buzite, of the kindred of Ram." And it says this in 32 in verse 2, and it says it in verse 3 as well, "Against not only Job, but also against his friends was his wrath kindled." Why? It says in 32 in verse 2, "Against Job it was kindled because he justified himself rather than God." It says in 32 in verse 3, that his wrath was also kindled against Job's friends because they had found no answer and they had condemned Job. Now perhaps I'm going all the wrong way with all of this, and perhaps we should say that Elihu's off his rocker, and Job's perfect, and Job hasn't messed up. But surely the text says that Elihu's got it right for a couple of reasons, as we'll examine here in a moment. It's interesting that Job later repents, and so maybe Elihu has something good to say. Maybe it's the case that we ought to consider the fact that Elihu is not mentioned in chapter 42 as one of the three friends who needs to repent. God gets all over Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, but not a word is said against Elihu as to why he needs to repent. Maybe it's the case that Elihu has it right. I'm going to progress as though he does. And his wrath is kindled against Job rightly. And his wrath is kindled against Job's friends rightly. And as we left off this morning, we haven't seen a good answer yet as to why it is that Job is suffering. Job says that it's because God's unjust. Job's friends say that it's because of his sin. But neither of those answers seem to do justice to what's really going on in the text. And so in chapter 32 and verses 5 through 9, Elihu says, "I must speak." There's a reason now that I must speak. And take a look at 32:5 where it says this, "When Elihu saw that there was no answer in the mouth of these three men, his wrath was kindled." And there ought to be something about you, and there ought to be something about me as well. When people cannot answer questions, and they're claiming to have the answers, something ought to grab a hold of us, and we're angry about it. One of the things that burns me up more than anything else is when I hear people spouting off denominational error. I remember being at the university campus when I was finishing my bachelor's degree, and I walked out of the student union one day, and there was a Baptist preacher standing on a crate, a milk crate, and he was preaching quite hellfire and brimstone kind of preaching at all of the students on campus, and nobody was paying him any mind. Naturally, I stopped and got into a discourse with him. It wasn't long before I was called a false teacher for saying that one had to be baptized for the remission of sins. Now, the interesting thing is, it's one thing to give no answer and not to claim to have an answer. It's another thing to claim to have the answer and give nothing. And that's where Job is burnt up with his friends. That's why Elihu now can't hold his peace. He's burnt up with Job's friends, and it's now time for him to speak. And we look at Elihu saying something now, not only to Job, but also to the friends. And he says this, and though it's harsh, though it comes across very bluntly, look at what he says. In verse 7, I said to myself, Elihu says, well, days should speak, and those that are of a multitude of years should be the ones to teach wisdom. But he'd listened long enough. And so it says in verse 9, it says, great men, Eliphaz, Zophar, Bildad, they're not always wise. Neither do the aged men always understand judgment. Though it's the case that Elihu's the younger man here, and the text bears that out, and Elihu had thought to himself, well, surely I should let the wiser older men answer the questions. In this case, that's not so. And Elihu has to come in and say the older men in this case have bombed. And so he addresses Job's friends and he says, you've not presented wisdom, you've not presented judgment. Take a look at chapter 32 and a little later on, where he says this in verse 12, there was none of you that convinced Job. None of you answered his words. Every single one of you has been chiding him for sin. Job has committed sin, and that's why the punishment's coming. But he says in 32:12, you've not really answered. And so we need to come to grips with the fact that a bad answer is tantamount to no answer at all. And that's where we as Christians have to be doing a better job at making sure we've got the answers. I cannot teach somebody else unless I have the material grasped first myself. And so when we have these ultra-radical individuals saying, well, we've got to be doing better about evangelism in the church, and we've got to be doing better about door knocking, and we've got to be doing better about getting a website up that looks good for the church, all of that may be true. But it's interesting when you find out there are people who don't know the answers are usually the ones saying we need to be having the answers. Well, that's great. But let's get the answers down first, and then let's start sharing them. But before we start sharing answers, let's make sure we have them right. Elihu is the one who has heard enough. He says it's time for us to figure this out. And so Elihu feels the need to speak. And so he says in 32:14, neither will I answer him with your speeches. I'm not going to give the answers that Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar gave. We've got to do better. And so he says 3 times in the text here, he says, I will give my opinion. He says it in 32:6. He says it in 32:10. He says it in 32:17. 3 times he says, I'm going to show you my opinion. Do you start to notice a little bit of a difference between Elihu and Bildad, Zophar, and Eliphaz? Maybe it's the fact that he's not so dogmatic, so assertive. Confidence, not the word here. Confidence is fine. But don't you see that the other 3 friends had assumed their position? Job's in sin and they can't tell him what it is. Don't you see that there's a problem? Elihu says, I've listened to all of you. I've listened to you say all of this, and not a one of you can present the sin in which Job is engaged. Elihu now feels the need to speak, but he says, I'm going to give you my opinion. And so he's more approachable than perhaps the other 3. And we need to take a lesson then on how to be tactful. Elihu knew how to approach Job. And there's an interesting thing here. The 3 friends had really done Job in. But Elihu now starts to serve as a bridge where Job can stomach what's about to come in the later chapters from God. Imagine if God had intervened at this point and directly now starts to address Job. Do you think Job's in any kind of psychological state to listen to the Almighty speak to him? Not at all. And so God sends his messenger, Elihu. And Elihu's going to bridge the gap between Job and God and make it possible that God then can speak to Job to where Job would receive the word of the Lord. In 33 it says this. Elihu starts to encourage Job, but one of the things that's very remarkable about Elihu's character is he doesn't tell Job it's time for you to sit and shut up and listen. And he says in 33 and verse 3, my words will be of the uprightness of my heart. I'm going to approach you with the right attitude, with a good motive. I'm not going to accuse you of being in sin and then not produce the sin. I'm not going to make assumptions about you and who you are. I'm going to tell you what I know, and it's going to be out of the goodness of my heart. And what's even further appreciative about Elihu is he says this in 33:5. By the way, Job, if you can answer me, set your words in order before me and stand up. He says later in 33, in verses 32 and 33, the end of the chapter, the last two verses of this chapter, he says again, Job, if you have anything to say, answer me. Speak, for I desire to justify thee. And if not, if you don't have anything to say against me, Job, then listen up unto me. Hold your peace, and I promise you I'll teach you wisdom. Elihu, the younger man, tells Job, if you do have a response, if you do have questions, raise your voice. He says, I'm giving you my opinion. I'm not coming off as dogmatic as your other friends who have just castigated you and chided you for being in sin. And Elihu seems much more inviting as a person in addressing the failure, really, of Job. Immediately we start to appreciate more about Elihu than we do the others. Something about Elihu speaks positively about who he is. Now, as we move into chapter 34, could it possibly be the case that Elihu could actually provide that answer for why Job was suffering? The answer we're going to find out here shortly is not much of an answer at all, but Elihu's got it right. But it's interesting that we read in chapter 33, we're going back to chapter 33. He says in 33:23, look at this. Elihu says to Job, he says, if there be a messenger with him, an interpreter, speaking with God that is, one among 1,000, to show unto man his uprightness, then he is gracious unto him and says, deliver him from going down to the pit. I have found a ransom. Elihu is speaking on God's behalf, and he says this. By the way, could I get somebody to give me a glass of water, please? My mouth is really dry. Caleb's got it, looks like. Thank you, Caleb. In Job 33, he says this in 23:24. He said, Job is being addressed by Elihu, and Elihu is speaking on God's behalf. And Elihu says, maybe it's the case that there's going to be an interpreter, somebody who can explain your affliction. Why are you suffering? Elihu is plainly telling us he's going to interpret Job's affliction. And so could it be the case that he can interpret it, that he can explain it? And he's going to go on and tell us what that is. Elihu says in a host of these passages here that both Job and Job's friends were wrong. You see, Job was wrong for saying that God was unjust. But Job's friends were wrong for saying that Job had sinned. And as we turn to chapter 35 and verse 14, look at exactly what Elihu has to say. Here's the answer. Here's what Elihu tells Job to go ahead and buy into. He says in 35 and verse 14, although thou sayest thou shalt not see him, yet judgment is before him, therefore still trust thou in him. Thank you, Caleb. In 35:14, he says, no matter what happened to you, Job, you should have kept your trust in the Almighty. And that's the point that God's trying to get across to us as well. Even sometimes when life looks really dark, really bleak, instead of saying, I feel like God is doing something wrongly to me, I feel like the injustice is coming from God upon me, God's saying the whole time, trust, trust, trust. And that's the lesson that Job needed to learn. Even when it looks dark and it looks like God's turned on us, keep your trust in Him. He's not abandoned. He's never left you nor forsaken you. I believe I read that somewhere. And so in Job chapter 36, we move in and Elihu goes on further. And he starts to praise God. He starts to address certain things about who God is. And he says in 36:7, he says that He withdraws not His eyes from the righteous. He says in verse 15, God's the kind of one who delivers the poor in affliction. And then he asks this question in 36:22, who teaches like God? Who knows how to build faith? Who knows how to draw us closer to God? There's nobody who can do it better than the Lord. And while Job may be wondering, how is this making sense? See, again, we're going to emphasize the point. The thing that's really gotten a hold of Job poorly is the senselessness of it all. He can't make sense of it. And the only way he knows to make sense of it is to blame God. But as we move into chapter 37 and 38, we start to see that Elihu has now left a bridge here, and all he has said, the only thing he's told us, is, Job, I really don't have an answer. Just trust God. Doesn't seem like much to go on. But it's from that finally somebody's starting to make a little bit of sense. And instead of saying that Job sinned, Elihu's basically throwing his hands up and saying, I can't explain it. Just trust God. But it's because now Job's prepared that the Lord speaks out of the whirlwind. 38:1. It says this in 38. It says in 38:1, Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind, and he said, Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Who are you, Job? Who are you to denigrate and to make unclean the speech of Elihu? Who are you to speak against this? And then he says in 38:3, look at what God says to Job. Boy, you talk about harsh language. In 38:3, God says to Job, Gird up your loins like a man. I will demand. You've asked for this. I will demand that you answer me. Wow. Imagine if the Lord had heard us chiding Him all the while, saying if only God were here, I'd debate with Him. I'd prepare arguments. I'd order my cause. I'd tell Him what true justice is like. And then lo and behold, here comes God speaking to us out of the whirlwind and saying, You've asked for this, now let's get it on. Do you see how forceful God comes? And now Job is prepared to hear the speech of the Lord. Up to this point, he wasn't ready. But God, through the messenger of Elihu, has prepared him to listen to exactly what it is God has to say. And now God comes and He says, Get ready. It's about time for you to listen up. In chapters 38, 39, 40, and 41, God forcefully asks rhetorical question after rhetorical question. Well, Job, where were you when the earth was formed? When the foundation of the earth was laid, who did it? Oh, by the way, when I made the behemoth and I created him, where were you? Oh, what about those stars, Arcturus and Orion, that are out there in the distance, and you know about them? Who put those there, Job? Who do you think? And what do you think Job might say to all of this? Not me. Then who in the world are you to judge the Almighty? Who in the world are you to tell Him He's done wrong? And that's the problem that Job's facing. It's pride. And it's the same problem that you and I face when we go through the crisis and we think that poor is me, woe is me. Because God's saying, Drew, even though it looks bad, God's held your hand every step of the way. And even though that He hasn't maybe given you everything you've asked for, He's still trying to teach you to trust in Him and glorify Him in the affair. Job has failed to look at how can God be found just, and he's looked only at how can I be found just. Instead of arguing for his self-righteousness, Job should have been arguing for God's righteousness. And he's missed it there. Well, in 38, God's answered him with a couple of things. He keeps asking him question after question. And He's going to produce marvelous questions in spite of what Job has argued for why he serves as God of the universe and not Job. Now, this is one of those things where God finally tells Job, it's time for you to sit, shut up, and listen. And that's exactly what God does for 4 chapters. But then it's interesting as we move into chapter 40, we don't have time to read all of those questions that God did ask Job, and they are many. But in chapter 40, look at the response that Job gives in 40 verse 1. It says, Moreover, the Lord answered Job and said, Shall he, Job, that contends with the Almighty, will you, Job, really instruct me? And you, Job, that reproves me, God, will you really be able to answer it? And look at the right response that comes forth from Job in 40 and verse 3. Job answered the Lord and said, Behold, I am vile. What can I? What will I answer you? I'll lay my hand upon my mouth. Once I've spoken, yea, I will not answer. Actually twice, but I will proceed no further. Job knows he's missed. He knows he's bombed. He knows he's failed. And he says exactly what's right. The entire time he should have been thinking, God is just. How is He using me? How am I to be operative in this affair, in this crisis? And Job makes the right statement in saying, I don't have an answer for you, God. I boasted that I did, but it's not there. And so as we move into chapter 40 a little bit further, in 40 verse 14, the kind of God that you and I serve is the same kind of God that answers Job and says in 40:14, if you can answer these questions, all of those questions about who formed the earth, where were you when it was formed, what about the stars, what about these beasts, what about all of the things in the world? Job, can you answer all of this? God says, if you can answer all of these things, verse 14, then will I confess unto thee that you by your own right hand can save yourself. The point in it all is this. You and I might come up with some grand scheme whereby we've got life figured out. And we can make sense of all of the inner workings of the world. But God's telling us this. Until you can answer all of the questions of the world, you need a different Redeemer. You need somebody else to trust in rather than us. The day I start to think maybe I can figure out how salvation comes about, maybe I can do it on my own terms and I don't need that man who died on the cross, then that's the day when God is saying, then when you've got it figured out, Drew, I'll let you take matters into your own hands, and by your own right hand you can find salvation. But until then, we ought to do it God's way. And the point of it all is this. God's once again being quite rhetorical with Job. You'll never do it. You better keep your trust in me, the Almighty One who created you. You don't instruct me. You don't tell me how it is. I'm your creator. And so then we run into these two beasts. In 40, verses 15 through 24 talks about the behemoth. And then chapter 41 talks about the Leviathan. How should we handle these two creatures? This is one of those big questions that a lot of the scholars have tried to wrangle with and identify. It seems clear to me that we should go one major way with all of this. Number one, we could say that these animals are legitimate creatures in history. And so some have said that the behemoth is the elephant, and some scholars like John T. Willis, an Old Testament professor at Abilene Christian, and several others have argued that the Leviathan is the crocodile. Now immediately this starts to have some difficulty because the Leviathan, as discussed in chapter 41, so it says in verses 16 through 20, spews fire out of his mouth. How would you handle that? I don't know of a crocodile like that, and I've been to a couple zoos. But I've never seen a crocodile spit fire out of its mouth. So maybe we should go a different way with all of this. I want to go to a couple of different passages with you at this moment. Take a look at Daniel chapter 7. And I want to show you a passage in the prophets that's quite different from the literature we're used to reading. You and I, if you read the literature like most of us do, we're accustomed to the epistles or the basic straightforward history of the Old Testament, where it says this king did this, he reigned this long, he kept the word of the Lord, or he didn't, that sort of thing. It's pretty straightforward. But as you get into the poetic literature, which is what the book of Job is, or you get into the prophetic literature, which is what the Old Testament prophets are and the book of Revelation is considered, you get into some highly creative, imaginative reading. And in Daniel chapter 7, we begin in verse 3, where he sees these four great beasts, diverse, and each one was better than the first. And it says this in verse 4, here's a lion that had eagle's wings. That surely sounds fictitious to us, doesn't it? Well, that's because Job is in a vision. Take a look at verse 4, or verse 5. Here's another beast like unto a bear. And it raised itself up on one side and had 3 ribs in the mouth of it. That sounds suitable to us. We know about bears. But as you go on and you look at verse 6, it says something about a leopard. And this leopard had upon the back of it 4 wings of a fowl, and the beast had also 4 heads. Maybe you can start to see why this is a little bit different from what you and I have experienced in our lives. And then in verse 7 and verse 8, it talks to us about this great beast, which is described something like a dragon, but it says that it had dreadful and terrible and strong characteristics about it. It had iron teeth, it had 10 horns, and then another 11th little horn came up. All of this is highly figurative, of course. But how then does this relate to the text we're working with in Job 41 and the Leviathan, a beast that is like a creature, a sea monster that comes up out of the sea, has multiple heads upon it, it spits fire out of its mouths? How do we wrangle with this kind of picture? I'm only giving you a glimpse of Daniel 7. I'm not going to Isaiah 27:1, which presents something about the crooked serpent, the sea creature, the Leviathan, which is also said to have 7 heads. I'm not going to the passages in Ezekiel 29:3 and Ezekiel 32:3 where it talks about the Leviathan. But here's the point I want to make. All of these things, it seems to me, are fictitious symbols. And so when you think about the text that's being presented in Job, this text has several historical similarities in the pagan literature. Now here's the point. The Bible did not come into existence in one day. But the Bible was written with other historical documents at its side. On the one hand, you had the biblical literature. And how do you know that we have the Bible? The manuscripts. We've got data. This is what the Bible said. Similarly, there are archaeological finds, whether it's on clay tablets, stone, scrolls, or whatever. But the pagans, not God followers, had their own body of literature as well. And that's what I'm going to use this to represent. The pagan literature also spake of Lotan, the great Leviathan, the multi-headed dragon. And I could give you those references all over the place. Dr. James Pritchard, who was a professor at Princeton University, he edited a 300-page book called The Ancient Near Eastern Texts. And what it is translations of all of these pagan documents. The pagans also, people that followed Baal, also spake about Leviathan. What is the Bible doing with such literature? Is the Bible borrowing from the pagans, or are the pagans borrowing from the Bible? I don't think it's either. Here's what I think is going on. The symbol of Leviathan came to stand for all that was wicked, and all that opposed God, and all that was evil. And God uses that imagery and says, think, Job, think. Think about the Leviathan. Think about the dragon. Think about this beast and how formidable of an opponent he is. And then God says, I created him. He's not using an historical figure, an historical beast. He's speaking of an imaginative character, drawing up this Leviathan, something that does not literally exist, and says, even the most beastful thing that you can think of, I am greater than he. The point in it all, in Job 40 and 41, is that God is saying, you think of the behemoth, you think of the Leviathan. I am the creator even of these. If I were to ask of you what you think of when you think of a donkey, what would you say? Democrats. What about the elephant? The Republicans. What would the pagans and the Jews alike, what would they have thought upon hearing God speak to humankind about a Leviathan? A creature that has multiple heads, comes up out of the sea, spits fire out of its mouth. It's God's way of speaking highly poetically to say this. This is an embodiment of all that you can picture as evil. And it's God's way of saying this. Take a look at Job 41. Go back to Job 41 and look at what God is ultimately saying in this text. He says in Job 41 about the Leviathan, after going on lengthily about who he is, and some of these things just don't identify with an actual creature in our existence. He says in 41, 33 and 34, upon earth there is not his like, who is made without fear. Nobody else could beat this beast drawn up in the imagery that God's presenting to Job. And he says in 34, he, Leviathan, beholds all high things. He is a king over all the children of pride. He has exalted himself as everything that opposes and exalts itself against God. And God says, even as we paint this image of something so high and mighty, I am still greater than he and am considered his creator. Now how does Job feel in light of all of this? God's asked multiple questions. Job can't answer a one of them. Job looks pitiful and says, I'm vile. I can't answer you, God. How do you think Job ought to respond? This way. In chapter 42 and verse 1, Job answered the Lord and said, I know that you can do everything, God, and that no thought can be withholden from you. Who is he that hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore have I uttered that I understood not. He says, I said things that I didn't even know what I was talking about. I claimed that you were unjust. I claimed that you had wronged me. I said that I want to have a debate with you. Boy, I didn't know what I was talking about. And then he says at the end of verse 3, things that were too wonderful for me, I didn't even know. And he moves into verse 5 and he says, but now, after all of this, and I've been brought through the crisis, and you're addressing me, and you're explaining that you are the great and mighty God, and that even when I can't explain my suffering, I still ought to trust in you and reflect your glory. Now, Job says, my eye sees you. And it's because of that Job finally understands. He sees who God is, and he sees why he ought to reflect God's glory. That Job says in verse 6, I abhor myself and I repent in dust and ashes. What kind of response do we have before God when God looks at us and says, Drew, can you explain it all? And I say, no. Do I finally give it over to God and say I'm going to do whatever He says, even if it doesn't make sense, or do I go my own way and do whatever I think's best? More than one individual who hasn't converted to Christianity has objected to the plan of salvation because it's too simplistic, because it doesn't make sense to them. God never asked us to make sense of it all. He asked us to be obedient. And that's what He asked Job to be. And if you can't explain Christianity, that's another thing you need to do work on. But if you can't explain it, God never asked you to have all of the answers. He asked you to do work for Him and be obedient. And if you don't have the answers, try to find somebody who does, and come to grips with who God is and why we ought to serve Him, why we ought to trust in Him. In chapter 42, where does the end of the story take us? Well, God deals with Job and only the 3 friends. He doesn't deal with Elihu. And so in chapter 4, it says in verse 7, He speaks to Eliphaz and the 2, and He says, You've not spoken of me the thing that's right. Job has. Job has now gotten the point. Job has repented, and he's realized it's time to trust God. He says in 42 and verse 8, He says, You've not spoken of me the thing which is right. My servant Job has. He says in 42:9, it's time for you to listen up. And the Lord commands them as He had also commanded Job. And it says in verse 10 that the Lord turned the captivity of Job back from him when he prayed for his friends. And the Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before. They bring the offerings before. Job prays for his friends. They make penitence before God. And then we look at 42:11. We might have questioned at this point, well, did God really do all of this, or was it Satan the whole time? Or maybe we should blame the friends. Or maybe we should blame another. Who did all of this to Job? The narrator is clear. And in 42:11 he says this, They bemoaned him and comforted him over all the evil that the Lord had brought upon him. Make no mistake about it, Job was persecuted by God. Make no mistake about it, sometimes we suffer at the hand of God. But it's God's way of trusting in us to come to the crisis and show that even out of the midst of despair, we're going to do enough to where we remain faithful to Him. And that's why James could later write in the New Testament, Haven't you heard about the patience of Job? Haven't you heard how he was tested? And in all of that, even when he felt like God was an unjust God, he still served Him. Later he had to make a remark about repenting about some things, but nonetheless, he still served God. Well, what will we do? And what are some of the lessons we can learn? Number one, we can learn that senseless suffering, as it seems to us, is definitely grievous. Who wants to go through suffering? Job didn't. But nonetheless, while it's grievous, there's a way to handle grief. And his 3 friends didn't know a thing about it. They didn't know how to address the person that was going through the hardest trial of his life. And instead, they afflicted him and made it worse. The second thing we can learn is we need to be careful, like Eliphaz and Bildad and Zophar were not, to assume and draw up our own idea about God or people. And we need to be careful not to assume too much about each other. Job's friends had assumed he's a sinner. He doesn't do anything. And God, of course, comes in at the latter end of it all and says, no, Job had done right. He hadn't been in sin. He was suffering because Satan wanted to get at him, and God said, I'll let you suffer. I'll let him suffer. I'll actually be the one to turn my hand upon him. I'll take all of it from him. And God says, and the reason I know all of this and the reason I do it is because Job will ultimately reflect my glory, and I trust him enough to be the kind of individual he needs to be. The third thing we need to realize is we can use tact in addressing people. You see how Elihu got through to Job? You see how he made it possible that God could finally come out and address Job? Zophar, Bildad, Eliphaz didn't. But Elihu did. He was tactful about it, and we ought to learn something about that as well. We learn a fifth thing, and fourth thing, I guess, that I've got listed here. We ought to let God use us in whatever way that He sees fit for His glory. Even if I can't make sense of it, it's for God's glory that we live the way we do and reflect who He is. And then a fifth thing, the most important thing to learn in all of this is no matter what comes your way, don't give up on God. Well, this evening, have you, or are you a faithful child of His? Have you put your stock in Him by obeying the plan of salvation as it's laid out in the New Testament, by hearing His words, Romans 10:17, by believing in Him as the risen Lord, Jesus Christ, coming out of the tomb on the third day, John 14:6? Have you confessed that He is the Lord? Romans 10, 9, and 10. Have you repented of a past wicked way of life? Acts 17, 30 and 31. Have you been immersed into Christ, the Redeemer who came to bring us out of sin? Acts 2:38. Or do you stand without a Redeemer? If you haven't become a child of God, you need to this evening. If you are, but you've erred, and you've walked away, and you've given up on God, and you need to come home, whatever your needs may be, won't you come forward while we stand and sing?